When Harper pushed open the heavy mahogany doors to the bridal suite on that sun-drenched morning in Newport, Rhode Island, she had absolutely no idea that a chapter of her life she considered permanently closed was about to burst open with an overwhelming force. The entire historic coastal mansion, situated right at the edge of the famous cliff walk, was drowning in a spectacular sea of white lilies and roses that had been flown in from across the ocean just for this occasion. Dozens of staff members wearing immaculate white gloves hurried nervously through the grand halls, adjusting the heavy silk draperies on the sweeping staircases and polishing the crystal champagne flutes until they sparkled like diamonds caught in the bright morning sunlight. Outside, beneath an absolutely gigantic canvas tent erected on the manicured oceanfront lawn, a string quartet was already practicing classical symphonies, while local society photographers were busy setting up their expensive lenses in eager anticipation of capturing the most elite members of the coastal high society. Harper was 35 years old and the proud owner of a small but incredibly highly regarded makeup studio located in the charming, historic downtown district of the city. Her face, which always remained completely natural and radiating a profound sense of inner peace, was beautifully framed by chestnut hair pinned back into a practical, elegant chignon to keep it out of her way while she worked. Even though she had never walked down the aisle herself, a very delicate silver chain bearing a tiny, inexpensive silver pendant always hung around her neck, serving as the solitary piece of her deeply private personal life that she strictly never discussed with anyone. She was not a celebrity by any stretch of the imagination, nor did she possess any connections within the ruthless world of big corporate business, yet her skilled hands possessed a nearly magical ability to draw out the absolute best and most authentic beauty from every single woman she touched, largely because she deeply understood that beneath every layer of expensive foundation, there usually hid a profoundly personal and often painful human story. On this particular day, she had been exclusively hired to prepare a young bride coming from one of the most powerful and wildly affluent families on the entire eastern seaboard of the United States. The monetary rate offered for this single morning of work was simply staggering, easily enough to completely cover the monthly rent for her downtown studio space for 2 full years, and allow her to purchase the most advanced professional equipment available on the market. She had accepted the lucrative commission without a single moment of hesitation, completely unaware of the groom's last name, which was a fairly common practice in her discreet line of work when dealing with extremely private, high-security social events. She stepped fully into the opulent room, wearing her signature warm professional smile, carrying her heavy leather case filled with brushes and palettes as if it were a treasure chest, utterly oblivious to the terrifying fact that she was stepping directly back into a painful past that had never truly stopped haunting her quiet existence. The young bride, Brooke, was seated silently in front of a massive, ornate vanity mirror, draped elegantly in a pure silk robe that cascaded smoothly down her incredibly slender frame. She was strikingly beautiful, but deep within her eyes, which seemed to stare blankly right through her own reflection, lurked the unmistakable heavy shadow of a profound and quiet sorrow. There was absolutely none of the nervous, joyful excitement typically found in women preparing for their wedding day, but rather a chilling sense of complete resignation that instantly made Harper feel a massive wave of protective sympathy wash over her. Brooke spoke in a very soft, fragile whisper, almost as if she were terrified that speaking any louder might completely shatter the incredibly fragile illusion of a perfect day that other, more powerful people had completely orchestrated on her behalf. "Are you Harper?" Brooke asked quietly, not even bothering to turn her head away from the glass. "I have heard so many wonderful things about you. Specifically, that you have hands capable of working absolute miracles and bringing out the true essence of a person when they need it most." Harper, methodically organizing her pristine brushes on a freshly laundered white towel, offered a gentle, reassuring smile. "Miracles are entirely the business of the heavens, my dear. I am merely a humble artisan who tries very hard to gently highlight the strength and beauty that already exists inside of you. True beauty never comes from a jar of powder, but directly from the soul, even if that soul is feeling a little bit dimmed by the heavy weight of the world at the present moment. Brooke finally looked away from the mirror and directly at her makeup artist, and for the very first time that entire morning, a genuine, completely authentic spark of human understanding flashed brightly in her tired eyes. "Today, I am going to desperately need both of those things," she whispered back, and Harper simply nodded with profound understanding, immediately beginning her meticulous, soothing work. While she gently applied delicate highlighters and soft tones to the young woman's face, the heavy suite doors kept swinging open, as bridesmaids and aggressive personal assistants barged in constantly, loudly discussing corporate politics, upcoming trade contracts, and the arrival of high-profile guests who frequently graced the front pages of national newspapers. The entire atmosphere in the room felt significantly more like the tense, high-stakes boardroom meeting of a massive financial corporation, rather than the joyous, loving preparations for a sacred union between two individuals. "Did you happen to see exactly who just pulled up to the main iron gates?" one of the overly excited bridesmaids asked loudly, practically shoving her way into the center of the suite while gripping her smartphone tightly. "The state senator has finally arrived, and he brought the entire corporate board of directors along with him for the reception. This single marriage is going to permanently merge two of the most massive financial empires in the entire country, making it without a doubt the absolute event of the century here in Newport." Another bridesmaid enthusiastically nodded in vigorous agreement, completely and totally ignoring the fragile emotional state of the young woman actually getting married. "The Wright family is going to officially take over the vast majority of the holding shares by Monday morning, making this a wedding that financial experts will be analyzing in economic textbooks for the next 20 years. Harper suddenly felt as though time had completely stopped moving, causing the air inside the luxurious suite to instantly become impossibly thick and incredibly difficult to breathe. Wright. That specific last name struck her directly in the center of her chest, like a massive, jagged stone, hurled with tremendous force, by someone intentionally trying to destroy her from the inside out. Her professional hands, which were usually so steady and incredibly precise, began to tremble uncontrollably, causing a delicate makeup brush to slip right through her fingers and land softly onto the thick, expensive Persian rug covering the floor. Harrison Wright, the very man who had once looked her directly in the eyes and made a solemn promise that he catastrophically failed to keep. The man who was now apparently about to become the son-in-law of the most influential developer in the state, officially sealing the exact corporate fate he had desperately sworn he was running away from 10 years ago. Harper slowly leaned down to retrieve the fallen brush, trying desperately to calm the aggressive shaking in her fingertips. But inside her racing mind, vivid memories from a decade ago violently crashed over her in a fraction of a second. She had been exactly 25 years old back then, working exhausting, incredibly long shifts in a tiny, severely underfunded hair salon located on the very edge of town, where every single day was a grueling battle for basic survival, and her quiet evenings were spent eagerly reading borrowed books by the dim light of a cheap desk lamp. Harrison had been a bright, passionate law student at the time, the wealthy son of the owners of a massive real estate development firm, but during those magical, stolen months, his immense family wealth had meant absolutely nothing to either of them. They would secretly meet by the rocky coastal cliffs, happily eating cheap sandwiches bought from a tiny corner deli, and spending countless hours dreaming out loud about a wonderful future that was supposed to be remarkably simple and completely overflowing with unconditional love. Harrison was so wonderfully different from all the other people from his elite social circle that she was forced to meet later on down the line. He could happily sit with her on a weathered wooden park bench for an entire afternoon, completely forgetting about his incredibly expensive tailored suits, choosing instead to passionately discuss classic poetry or ancient philosophy until the sun finally dipped below the horizon. It was during one of those beautiful evenings that he had proudly given her this exact silver pendant, purchased for mere pennies at a dusty local antique market, accompanied by a solemn promise that one day he would gladly replace it with something truly worthy of symbolizing their entire life together. Harper had believed him with every single ounce of her heart, even when Harrison's mother, a terrifyingly elegant woman possessing an incredibly icy stare and a literal heart of solid stone, aggressively began to violently interfere in their pure relationship, treating Harper exactly like a filthy intruder trespassing into her perfectly planned, elite world. Eleanor Wright had, on one particularly gloomy afternoon, forcefully summoned Harper to her massive, intimidating coastal estate, a home that felt incredibly vast and utterly devoid of any real human warmth. Sitting perfectly centered on a highly polished mahogany table was a thick, elegant envelope filled with cash, which in the eyes of the cruel older woman held a significantly higher value than the genuine, profound feelings of two young people deeply in love. "I do not need a single penny of your money," she distinctly remembered saying out loud, forcing her spine to remain perfectly straight even though she was violently shaking with absolute terror on the inside. "I only want to be by his side because we truly love each other." Eleanor had immediately burst into a harsh, cruel laughter that sounded exactly like heavy glass shattering onto a hard stone floor. "Love, my naive dear, is a pathetic luxury, reserved exclusively for the poor, an emotion that quickly fades into nothing, whereas family business interests are designed to last for all eternity." Harper had walked away from that terrifying mansion with her chin held remarkably high, although she deeply felt that she was leaving a massive, vital piece of her own soul completely behind on those manicured lawns. She had faithfully waited for Harrison at their absolute favorite hidden spot near the cliffs for 3 days and 3 nights, praying he would come, but he absolutely never showed his face. Instead of the man she loved, the very next morning she received a devastating, typewritten letter, composed in a chillingly cold and completely foreign corporate style, in which someone clearly pretending to be her beloved wrote that he never wanted to see her again, that he was consciously choosing his comfortable, wealthy lifestyle, and that she had merely been a temporary, meaningless infatuation. Harper had absolutely no way of knowing back then that this forged letter was an immediate, calculated death sentence, deliberately executed by his mother, to permanently destroy their shared chance at a happy future. Over the incredibly difficult passing of the years, Harper painstakingly rebuilt her entire shattered life directly on the jagged ruins of those broken romantic dreams. She was forced to dedicate all her time to caring for her deeply ill mother, slowly paying off the massive debts left behind by her absent father, and working incredibly grueling hours in order to finally open her very own professional makeup studio. She had strictly never allowed herself the emotional vulnerability to ever trust another man again, because every single time she even slightly approached the idea of intimacy, it tragically ended with the overwhelming memory of Harrison and a deep, agonizing pain that had never completely burned itself out. She had incredibly transformed into a remarkably strong, entirely independent woman, but buried deep down in the absolute bottom of her guarded heart, she was still that deeply hopeful 25-year-old girl, endlessly waiting for an honest explanation that had simply never arrived. Now, exactly 10 years later, she was standing perfectly still in the very same luxurious bridal suite where she was officially expected to beautifully prepare an innocent young woman to marry the only man who had ever been her first and truly only great love. Harper took a massive, incredibly deep breath, desperately attempting to regulate the frantic rhythm of her racing heart, which was currently pounding aggressively against her temples, exactly like a heavy ceremonial drum. She absolutely had to remain a consummate professional, no matter what happened next. Her complicated life was no longer just about her own bruised feelings. It was also heavily, deeply rooted in the fierce personal pride and professional reputation she had painstakingly built from scratch over the last decade of extremely hard work. She resumed applying the intricate bridal makeup to Brooke's face, trying with all her might to intensely focus only on the precise artistic task at hand, even though every single delicate stroke of her brush felt heavily burdened by a tragic past that could never be erased or changed. Brooke, being incredibly perceptive and easily noticing the sudden, dramatic shift in Harper's usually calming physical demeanor, began to watch the makeup artist extremely closely through the reflection of the large vintage mirror. She keenly observed that the talented woman was now intentionally avoiding looking anywhere near the framed engagement photographs resting on the marble fireplace mantel, and that her professional hands, which had previously been wonderfully steady, were now betraying a very slight, undeniable tremor. Have you ever been so deeply and profoundly in love with someone that the entire rest of the world around you completely ceased to have any real meaning? The bride asked, in a quiet, fragile voice, and that highly specific, piercing question struck Harper directly in the chest, exactly like a brilliant bolt of lightning striking from a perfectly clear blue sky. Harper hesitated for a long, agonizing moment, but something profound about the bride's raw, unfiltered honesty forcefully compelled her to abandon her professional walls and finally speak her own truth. "I absolutely did love someone like that," Harper finally answered after a heavy, lingering silence, gently applying a soft, rosy blush to the bride's high cheekbones. "Exactly 10 years ago, I foolishly thought with all my heart that it was going to be an epic, sweeping love meant to last for my entire lifetime. But real life, or rather the deeply cruel people who arrogantly believed they knew significantly better than us regarding what was acceptable, highly successfully managed to tear us completely apart. And even though so many long years have passed since that terrible time, the incredibly fragile part of me that once blindly believed in our beautiful future together has truly never fully managed to heal from the damage." Harper, completely absorbed in her own heartbreaking confession, entirely failed to notice that the heavy oak doors to the suite had been left slightly ajar, and that someone was standing quietly right on the other side. Someone who absolutely never should have heard a single word of that deeply private conversation. Harrison Wright, impeccably dressed in a flawlessly tailored black tuxedo, had briefly paused right outside the entrance to the bridal suite, simply wanting to quickly check if his beautiful bride-to-be was finally ready for their scheduled portrait session. The devastatingly honest words that clearly floated through the open gap instantly nailed his polished leather shoes directly to the hardwood floor. Harper's familiar voice, although noticeably quieter and significantly filled with a profound, lingering pain, acted exactly like a massive echo chamber of buried memories that he had desperately attempted to keep locked away in the darkest corners of his mind for the past decade. His handsome face, which usually wore a perfectly constructed mask of unshakable corporate confidence that he smoothly presented to aggressive media outlets and ruthless business partners, suddenly drained of all its color, while an expression of absolute, unadulterated shock appeared in his eyes, a look that absolutely no one in his elite social circle had witnessed in a very long time. For a frantic, terrifying moment, Harrison desperately wanted to kick the door wide open, to loudly scream at the top of his lungs, to frantically explain everything that had happened. But his frozen physical body absolutely refused to obey the frantic commands of his racing brain. He stood there paralyzed, listening closely, as Harper sadly spoke about a cruel letter, about profound disappointment, and about the countless, agonizing years she had spent trapped in a quiet, lonely existence. Every single devastating word she spoke felt exactly like a vicious strike from a heavy leather whip across his back, violently forcing him to fully realize the massive, catastrophic scale of the elaborate lie he had been living inside for so many years. He had been completely and entirely convinced that Harper had selfishly abandoned him, that she had happily accepted the envelope of cash from his mother and vanished into thin air without ever bothering to look back. And now, on his wedding day, he was discovering that the actual truth was entirely different, and that they had both been the tragic, helpless victims of a vicious, calculated manipulation that had ruthlessly destroyed the best years of their lives. At that exact, highly charged moment, the heavy doors of the suite were suddenly pushed wide open, and in proudly marched Eleanor, a terrifyingly elegant older woman whose every single calculated footstep seemed to aggressively establish a massive distance between herself and the rest of the inferior world. When her sharp, piercing gaze finally landed directly on Harper's face, she completely froze in her tracks for a fraction of a second, and a very brief flash of genuine, uncharacteristic fear appeared deep in her eyes, before she instantly covered it up with her trademark, impenetrable mask of extreme aristocratic superiority. "I absolutely did not expect that it would be you providing the hired service for us on this particular morning," she declared in an incredibly icy, condescending tone, slowly lowering herself into a plush velvet chair positioned right next to the ornate vanity. Harper absolutely refused to look away, impressively maintaining a flawless, professional posture, even though beneath the surface, the blood in her veins was boiling with a massive, almost uncontrollable surge of ancient anger. "Work is merely work, Eleanor," Harper calmly replied, forcing her voice to remain perfectly steady as she meticulously finished blending the final touches of makeup onto Brooke's pale skin. "I am solely here to perform the specific job I was hired to do, and certainly not to stand around dwelling on a painful past that, for me, is now nothing more than a fading memory of a completely different lifetime." Eleanor let out a sharp, highly sarcastic laugh, openly glaring at Harper with undisguised contempt, acting exactly as if Harper was still that naive, broke girl from the cheap hair salon who could easily be bribed into disappearing. "I sincerely hope that your professional makeup skills are significantly better than the disastrous life choices you used to make, because I absolutely will not tolerate a single, solitary mistake on such an incredibly vital day for the future of our family." Harper instantly felt Brooke violently flinch beneath her gentle touch, clearly disturbed by the toxic energy radiating from the older woman. She knew right then that she absolutely had to remain strong, not just for her own wounded pride, but heavily for this young, fragile bride, who suddenly reminded Harper so intensely of the lost, frightened version of herself from 10 years ago. "I am certainly not here to debate the merits of my personal life with you. I am here solely to ensure that the lovely bride experiences a profound sense of peace and looks absolutely radiant on what is supposed to be the most important day of her life," Harper fired back smoothly, deliberately emphasizing her words to firmly demonstrate to Eleanor that the cruel woman no longer held any power or influence over her existence. The wealthy older woman abruptly stood up from the chair, aggressively adjusted her wildly expensive pearl necklace, and swiftly stormed out of the room, leaving behind an atmosphere that was incredibly thick with unresolved tension. Brooke looked up at Harper with a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude, almost as if that incredibly brief but intense verbal exchange had magically provided the young bride with a hidden well of strength that she simply could not locate within herself. "Is she genuinely always this completely miserable and terrifying to be around?" Brooke asked quietly, staring cautiously at the heavily closed wooden doors. Harper let out a very long, tired sigh, carefully placing her used brushes back into their designated slots within her leather case. "People who are absolutely terrified of losing their tight grip of control over others frequently utilize extreme arrogance as a heavy shield to protect themselves. But the tragedy is that those protective shields eventually transform into very lonely, highly isolated prisons over time." Brooke did not say another word in response, but a profound, shining light of absolute understanding appeared in her eyes, strongly suggesting that she was rapidly beginning to view her entire impending marriage and her future family in a drastically different, highly revealing light. Just as the final layer of setting spray was applied, and Harper began to expertly twist Brooke's hair into a flawless, elegant updo that perfectly complemented her delicate facial features, Harrison suddenly walked completely into the room, entirely disregarding the strict traditional protocol that completely forbade the bride and groom from seeing one another before the official ceremony began. He stopped dead in his tracks right in the main doorway, and his desperate eyes immediately sought out and locked onto Harper's intense gaze through the reflection in the vanity mirror. Time inside the luxurious room seemed to slow down to an impossible crawl, and the bustling, loud noises from the outside world, including the beautiful music and the lively chatter of the wealthy guests, became completely and utterly inaudible to both of them. Every single other person currently inside the vast mansion ceased to exist. The only thing that truly mattered in the entire universe was this one, heavy, devastating look that had finally reconnected after 10 incredibly long, agonizing years apart. Harrison slowly took a few hesitant steps forward, moving almost as if he were absolutely terrified that making any sudden aggressive movements might cause this entire, surreal situation to shatter and reveal itself as nothing more than a cruel, incredibly vivid dream. Harper, intensely feeling the heavy, burning weight of his lingering stare directly on her skin, desperately tried to remain completely focused on styling the hair, but her usually reliable hands were now shaking so aggressively that she was forcefully compelled to set the silver comb down on the marble counter. "Mr. Wright, I must kindly ask that you please do not interfere with my work right now. The young bride still absolutely needs to complete her final preparations before the ceremony," she stated clearly, desperately attempting to project a highly neutral, professional tone, even though her trembling voice violently betrayed a massive ocean of unresolved emotions she simply could not hide. He, however, did not listen to a single word she said. He stepped even closer, staring at her with a heartbreaking mixture of profound agony and complete disbelief. "Harper, is it truly, actually you standing here?" he asked, and his deep voice was so incredibly overflowing with raw, unfiltered emotion that even Brooke, sitting quietly in the styling chair, physically felt the massive, crushing weight of those very few words. Harper finally turned her body around, violently forcing herself to look directly into the deep eyes of the man who had shattered her world. "Yes, it is me. I am currently working here strictly in my professional capacity as a hired makeup artist. Absolutely nothing else about my presence should be of any interest or concern to you today." Harrison physically recoiled, looking entirely as if he had just been brutally punched directly in the stomach. He clearly saw exactly how much she had changed, how the deeply hopeful, incredibly bright girl he once loved had slowly transformed into a fiercely guarded woman, possessing a gaze filled with heavy sorrow and complete mistrust. "This is all completely my fault, isn't it?" he asked in a very quiet whisper, entirely ignoring the highly awkward presence of his current fiancée sitting just a few feet away. Brooke, having silently witnessed this intensely emotional, incredibly revealing exchange unfold right in front of her, very slowly stood up from the plush vanity chair, staring intently at her wealthy fiancé with a completely unfamiliar, highly analytical expression dominating her beautiful face. "Do the two of you actually know each other from the past?" she asked, and the absolute calm in her soft voice was incredibly unexpected, given the explosive circumstances. Harrison did not respond immediately, keeping his eyes firmly, desperately fixed on Harper's face. "We used to know each other very well, long before my entire life was forcibly turned into a pathetic, heavily scripted performance written entirely by someone else," he finally answered with profound bitterness. Harper strongly felt a desperate need to immediately interrupt this rapidly escalating scene, before the highly volatile situation transformed into a spectacular, extremely public disaster that would ruin her professional reputation forever. "Please accept my sincere apologies for the interruption, but I absolutely must finish the job I was hired to do," she firmly stated, quickly reaching for her heavy leather case. "Brooke, everything on my end is completely finished. You look absolutely breathtakingly gorgeous today." Without waiting for any sort of response or permission, she began rapidly packing up her expensive supplies, desperately wanting to flee from this deeply uncomfortable, suffocating environment as quickly as humanly possible. However, Harrison deliberately moved to block her only path of escape, standing firmly squarely in the center of the doorway. "I absolutely will not allow you to just walk away like this, especially not after everything I just heard you say earlier. We desperately need to have a real conversation." Harper glared at him with intense irritation, a powerful emotion that was heavily mixed with a deep, volcanic anger, and an incredibly profound, unhealed sense of romantic betrayal. "There is absolutely nothing left for us to discuss, Harrison. Exactly 10 years have passed. Everything that we ever had was completely buried underneath a massive mountain of cruel lies that I was forced to survive entirely on my own." Brooke calmly walked over to where they were standing, observing both of their intensely stressed faces with extreme, highly focused attention. She profoundly understood in that exact moment that this specific conversation was undoubtedly going to be the absolute most important turning point of her entire life, even if it was not exactly the joyful, romantic wedding moment she had once dreamed about as a little girl. "Harrison, I need you to leave the room right now and leave us alone for a few minutes. I absolutely must speak with Harper in private," Brooke commanded, and there was suddenly something so incredibly firm and unyielding in her tone that it completely forced the powerful businessman into stunned submission. Once the defeated man had finally backed out of the room and the heavy doors clicked shut, Brooke slowly sat back down on the plush velvet sofa and politely gestured to the empty space right next to her. "Harper, I fully realize that what I am about to ask might seem incredibly strange, but I believe I have a fundamental right to know the exact truth about the man I am supposed to pledge my entire life to in less than an hour." Harper slowly sat down on the edge of the sofa, deeply feeling that she simply possessed absolutely no energy left in her body to maintain the exhausting charade any longer. Brooke listened with complete, silent attention as Harper poured out the entire painful story of her profound love for a younger Harrison, the devastating lack of a promised future, the cruel, highly insulting bribe attempted by the vicious Eleanor, and the 10 long, incredibly lonely years of heartbreak that had ruthlessly followed that terrible day. When she finally finished speaking, a massive, incredibly heavy silence fell over the luxurious room, broken only by the faint, distant sounds drifting in from the manicured lawns, where hundreds of wealthy guests were rapidly beginning to grow restless and impatient. Brooke did not shed a single tear, nor did she scream in anger. She remained remarkably calm, acting exactly as if this devastating, tragic history was the very last missing piece of an incredibly complex puzzle she had been desperately trying to solve for many long months. "I sincerely want to thank you for having the courage to tell me the absolute truth," Brooke whispered softly, staring at her hands. "I finally understand exactly why he has simply never been able to look me directly in the eyes, in the deeply passionate way a man should look at the woman he truly loves. This entire grand marriage was never meant to be a real, loving partnership. It was entirely constructed as a lucrative corporate contract. Harrison has constantly lived under the terrifying, overwhelming pressure of his ruthless mother, but I never possessed the personal courage to confront him about it directly. Today, solely because of your honesty, I know for a fact that his distance was never about me, or any perceived lack of value on my part, but rather about the undeniable fact that his heart was never truly free to give." Harper instantly felt a massive, overwhelming surge of genuine respect for this incredibly brave young woman who possessed the immense emotional maturity to analyze such a devastating, life-altering situation with such profound clarity and grace. Before anything else could possibly happen inside the quiet suite, the heavy doors violently burst open once again, and Eleanor aggressively stormed into the room, her heavily manicured face twisted into a truly terrifying, incredibly ugly grimace of pure rage. Harrison desperately tried to physically hold her back in the hallway, but she had been significantly too fast for him to stop. Exactly what in the world is going on in here? The wealthiest guests in the state are waiting outside. The expensive orchestra has been playing for an hour, and the two of you are just sitting in here casually discussing ancient history? She screamed at the top of her lungs, completely and entirely ignoring Harper's physical presence on the sofa. Brooke slowly stood up from the furniture, and her entire physical posture was now completely overflowing with a profound, radiant dignity and fierce determination that the older woman had absolutely never witnessed in her before. "Eleanor, I must ask you to leave this room immediately," Brooke stated, and her incredibly steady voice echoed with a powerful, unshakable confidence. "This is supposed to be my special day, and, more importantly, it is my own life. I possess every single right to fully understand exactly who I am binding my entire future to, and to uncover the massive, incredibly toxic lies that have been strategically built directly into the foundational roots of our relationship." Eleanor completely froze in place, staring wildly at the young bride in a state of absolute, unadulterated disbelief. "Lies. What on earth are you talking about, you foolish child?" Harrison quickly stepped past his mother into the room, and the expression on his face was now incredibly cold and completely filled with a fierce, unstoppable determination that Harper had certainly never seen him display in the past. "Mother, we both know absolutely everything about the forged letter. We know about every single terrible thing you did," Harrison declared loudly, his deep voice carrying a heavy weight that commanded the entire room. "For 10 long years, I lived in the agonizing belief that Harper had cruelly rejected me, simply because she selfishly chose to take a bribe. For 10 entire years, I harbored a deep, toxic hatred for her, when in reality, it was you who completely and ruthlessly destroyed my entire life and my chance at true happiness." Eleanor desperately attempted to formulate a coherent response, but the words completely choked in her tightening throat. "I only did those things to protect you and ensure your glorious future," she finally screamed back, frantically trying to regain her slipping control over the rapidly collapsing situation. "You simply could not marry a pathetic, penniless girl who paints the faces of strangers for a living. She was absolutely never worthy of carrying our prestigious family name." Harper proudly stood up, looking absolutely directly into the cold, panicked eyes of the terrible woman who had once arrogantly attempted to purchase her dignity with an envelope of cash. "Eleanor, a family name is absolutely nothing more than a collection of meaningless letters printed on a piece of paper. The true, undeniable value of a human being is strictly measured by the kindness they show to others, not by the massive amount of wealth they hoard in a bank. These very hands, which you treat with such profound, disgusting contempt, have reliably fed me, continually educated me, and ultimately helped me build a highly successful, independent life, of which I am incredibly proud. I absolutely never had to destroy or manipulate another living soul in order to feel like a powerful, valuable person." Those calm, incredibly confident words struck the older woman significantly harder than any aggressive, violent scream ever could have. Harrison stared at his trembling mother with a profound, terrifying coldness that was undoubtedly far worse for her to endure than any display of fiery anger. "You no longer possess any power or influence over my life, Mother. Never, ever again." Brooke, having silently watched this entire magnificent display of truth, finally knew exactly what she had to do next. She calmly walked out of the room, absolutely refusing to look back at the stunned Eleanor, who was left standing completely alone in the center of the suite, staring at all of them in a state of absolute, helpless terror. Harrison quickly followed closely behind his former fiancée, deeply knowing that whatever was about to happen next would permanently alter the course of all their lives forever. Harper quietly gathered the very last of her professional belongings and slowly followed them out into the grand hallway, profoundly feeling that she simply could not abandon this incredible, life-changing story while it was still only halfway finished. They all walked steadily out into the massive, sunlit garden, where hundreds of extremely wealthy, heavily adorned guests instantly fell into a dead silence, eagerly waiting for the lavish ceremony to finally begin. Harrison confidently walked right up onto the raised, flower-covered wooden platform where the wedding was supposed to take place, and firmly took the microphone directly from the stunned officiant. "Ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for the massive confusion and delay, but today's ceremony absolutely cannot and will not take place," he announced clearly, and a massive, overwhelming wave of shocked gasps immediately rippled through the massive crowd of elite guests. Brooke proudly stood right beside him, looking out at the confused, whispering assembly, with her chin held remarkably high. Today, we finally discovered the absolute truth about ourselves, our histories, and the toxic manipulations of our families. It is fundamentally impossible to build any kind of lasting happiness on a crumbling foundation composed entirely of cruel lies. Harrison turned his head and looked directly at Harper, who was standing quietly near the back of the massive crowd, being the single solitary person in the entire garden who truly understood the incredible gravity of what was happening. "I would like to publicly apologize to Brooke for completely failing to give her the genuine, wholehearted love that she truly deserves. And I must also deeply apologize to myself for foolishly allowing other, highly toxic people to violently manage my own heart and dictate my choices for so many wasted years," he stated boldly. And his incredibly brave words actually prompted several younger guests to begin clapping loudly, while many others, including a deeply humiliated Eleanor, practically ran away from the garden in a massive rush to avoid the ensuing social scandal. Brooke then reached out and took the microphone into her own hands. "I want to thank everyone for traveling here today, but at this exact moment in my life, the most vital things to me are absolute personal freedom and undeniable truth." Harper absolutely did not stay to witness the chaotic aftermath of the cancelled reception. She very discreetly slipped away through a small, hidden rear exit in the garden, profoundly feeling the incredibly heavy, suffocating weight she had carried in her aching heart for 10 long years finally beginning to lift away into the coastal breeze. She absolutely did not feel a sense of vindictive triumph, but rather a very strange, incredibly deep sense of peaceful closure. She fully understood that even if Harrison absolutely never returned to her side, at the very least, the painful truth had finally been brought out into the bright light of day. The sun was very slowly beginning to hide itself right behind the distant ocean horizon, beautifully painting the expansive sky above Newport in incredibly rich, vibrant shades of deep purple and soft pink. She walked quietly toward her parked car, deeply contemplating just how incredibly unpredictable, wild, and surprising human existence could truly be when the truth was finally spoken. She had not even walked 100 yards down the cobblestone street when she suddenly heard the sound of heavy, rapid footsteps rushing up right behind her. "Harper, please, wait for me," Harrison called out desperately. She stopped walking, but she absolutely did not turn around right away. She could feel her heart beating wildly in her chest, even though she was trying extremely hard to maintain a calm, collected exterior. "I truly had absolutely no intention of completely destroying your wedding day," she stated softly, when she finally found the courage to turn around and face him. Harrison looked remarkably different now. He had completely discarded his formal tuxedo jacket, and his expensive silk tie was hanging loosely around his neck. He looked exactly like a highly exhausted man who had just successfully thrown off a massive, crushing weight that had been breaking his shoulders for a decade. "You were absolutely not the one who destroyed it, Harper. I am the one who completely destroyed it a very long time ago by cowardly agreeing to accept absolutely everything my ruthless mother forced upon me," he said, stopping just a few feet away from her. "Over the course of the last single hour, I have finally understood significantly more about life and love than I have over the entirety of the last 10 years. I deeply realized that I completely lost you solely because I was an absolute coward. And I refuse to be a coward for a single second longer." Harper looked at him with extreme caution, acting almost as if she were deeply afraid that this entire beautiful moment was merely another cruel illusion that was destined to violently shatter right in front of her eyes. "Things are simply not that incredibly easy, Harrison. We absolutely cannot just magically turn back the hands of time. Way too much damage has already occurred. she replied in a very quiet, guarded tone. "I have my own independent life now, my highly successful studio, and my own daily challenges. I am absolutely no longer the exact same innocent, naive girl that I was all those years ago. And you are certainly no longer that same carefree young boy." Harrison smiled at her with a profound, heartbreaking sadness. "I know that for a fact. But perhaps that exact reality is actually our greatest chance? Perhaps we can slowly begin all over again, but this time completely devoid of any toxic lies, and totally free from the terrible people who constantly try to control our destinies." Harper let out a very long, trembling sigh, looking deeply into his eyes for a very long time. She clearly saw a familiar, beautiful spark residing in his gaze, the exact same spark that had originally caused her to fall so madly in love with him in the past. But now it was heavily accompanied by a profound, seasoned maturity that had been completely absent back then. "I absolutely will not promise you anything at all right now," she stated firmly, and he slowly nodded his head in complete, respectful understanding. "I am absolutely not asking you for any grand promises today. I am simply begging for a small chance for us to talk quietly, without any terrible rush, without any overbearing pressure, and completely free from the heavy, dark shadow of the past that has been hanging over us for entirely too long." Over the course of the next several weeks, Harrison very slowly began making small, quiet appearances at her busy downtown studio, not acting at all like a highly influential corporate businessman, but rather as a humble, deeply remorseful man who desperately wanted to understand the beautiful life he had so foolishly lost. Sometimes he quietly helped her new, incredibly eager young assistant, Chloe, sweep the floors and organize the heavy boxes of supplies, while other times he simply brought hot coffee and fresh pastries baked by their friendly neighborhood baker, Marcus, and just sat quietly, listening to Harper tell fascinating stories about the countless local women who visited her shop not just for cosmetics, but for genuine emotional support. Harper slowly began to see the truly good, decent man he was always entirely capable of becoming, had his bright spirit not been ruthlessly crushed by the overwhelming toxic expectations of his elite family. The fragile relationship between them evolved remarkably slowly, constantly existing in the lingering shadow of old fears and deep insecurities. But with every passing day, it organically became significantly more authentic, grounded, and deeply real. Harrison eventually made the massive, life-altering decision to permanently resign from his family's corrupt real estate empire, effectively cutting off the primary source of all their historical misery, and instead bravely founded a very small ethical consulting firm that absolutely never forced him to compromise his personal morals. Harper, meanwhile, continued to heavily expand her beloved studio, which, largely thanks to the incredibly dramatic wedding story that had wildly circulated through the local coastal media, had rapidly transformed into a famous, safe haven where hundreds of women came desperately seeking both physical transformation and profound life inspiration. Brooke had also returned from her extensive travels across Europe, bursting with new energy, and the three of them surprisingly formed a beautiful, deeply supportive friendship that completely transcended the initial awkwardness of their shared history. Approximately 2 years later, on a beautifully crisp, golden autumn afternoon, Harper and Harrison finally stood together inside a tiny, incredibly charming coastal chapel located just a few miles down the road from where they first met, completely surrounded only by a very small group of genuine friends like Chloe, Marcus, and Brooke, without a single news reporter or wealthy family member in sight. They happily exchanged simple, highly meaningful vows that they had written themselves, officially cementing a beautiful, hard-won love that had miraculously survived the absolute worst forms of betrayal and manipulation. There were absolutely no massive floral arrangements imported from Europe, nor were there any terrifying corporate politicians waiting at the reception. There was only absolute, unfiltered joy, profound peace, and the undeniable certainty that they had both finally found their true, permanent home within each other. When you look back on the winding, often treacherous roads of your own life, always remember that true love and authentic happiness absolutely never require you to completely sacrifice your fundamental dignity or blindly surrender your personal dreams to satisfy the selfish demands of others. Throughout the numerous decades of our lives, we frequently encounter overbearing individuals who arrogantly believe they possess the ultimate right to dictate our paths, attempting to aggressively mold our futures using heavy guilt, financial pressure, or deeply rooted family obligations. However, the most profound, truly enduring victory any older adult can ever achieve is the quiet, magnificent realization that your own life story entirely belongs to you, and absolutely no one else holds the pen. It requires immense, terrifying courage to boldly say no to toxic expectations, and to bravely walk away from incredibly comfortable lies, even if it means you must endure a long, painful season of loneliness and struggle. True, lasting peace is never found by desperately conforming to a false, glittering image constructed by society, but rather by fiercely protecting the honest, sometimes messy truth residing deep within your own heart. Because only a life lived with absolute authenticity will ever allow your soul to truly rest and beautifully flourish in the end.